In this video, we will talking about how to configure user self-registration. User self-registration have divided into two parts, which is account self-registration and endpoint self-registration. Account self-registration is used on password-based authentication. It is used to log some personal information for management use. Endpoint self-registration is used on open authentication. It is used to log some personal information for management use. Now we will talk about account self-registration. Below are the configuration steps for account self-registration. Go to User, Self-Service, Registration, then press on the Add button to add a new registration policy. Enter the policy name. You can choose to add form field to collect users' information. Press the Add button to add the custom attribute. For example, we want to collect gender, the type for the attribute is text, then press on the Commit button to commit, then go back to the self-registration policy, choose the custom attribute for that created just now. Assign a default value for this field. You can make this field as required or not required. Registration support to bind mobile number or email address, you can click on the checkbox to select it. You may choose to add the user to the group that you want. For example, we choose the group that associated in authentication policy. For the approval options, it is used to decide the registration request required approval or not. If we select approval request, you may add admin account for approval. Click on the Add button to add an account. Enter the username and password. Need to take note on the permission. It will require that the account have permission for view and edit for new registration in order to approve registration request. Click on the Commit button to add the account. Now go back to user registration, click on the Refresh button to show that account that created just now. The Advanced option will show the validity period for the new register account and the binding options. Lastly, click on the Commit button to save the policy. Now go to Users, Authentication Policies. Click on the Add button to add a new authentication policy for self-registration. Enter the policy name. Assign the IP segment for the policy. For the authentication method, choose the password-based authentication. The authentication server, choose the local database. Then enable self-registration, and choose the self-registration policy that we created just now. Then click on the Commit button to save the policy. Now we will do testing for self-registration. On browser, try to access to internet. Then the captive portal will be prompted. Click on the Register. Fill up the registration form. After you fill up the email address, you will need to verify the email address as we choose the email binding just now. After receive the email, enter the OTP code to the form and click on the Register button. When showing this page, means that the registration form already submit. User will need to wait for approval only can log into their account. Now we will approve the registration request. Go to Users, Self-Services, New Requests. You will saw the new request that we submit just now. Click on the More will show the user details that we fill up. Click on the Approved to approve the request. You may click the Request History button to check the history. Now we will talk about endpoint self-registration. Go to Users, Self-Services, Registration. Click on the Add button to add the endpoint registration policy. The policy are similar to user registration policy. Enter the policy name. Add the form fields to collect user information. The policy also support mobile number or email binding. The endpoint registration policy will require to do binding on endpoint. For example, we do binding for IP address. The approval options are same with user registration policy. On advanced option, it have the validity period for the account. Click on the commit button to save the policy. Now we will configure the authentication policy. Go to Users, Authentication Policy. Click on the Add button, then enter the policy name. Assign IP segment that want to do authentication. On the authentication method, choose Open Authentication. The username options choose Obtain during self-registration, then choose the endpoint registration policy that we created just now. Lastly, click on the Commit button to save the policy. Now we will do testing for endpoint registration. On browser, try to access a website. After that, Captive Portal will be prompt to request registration. Fill up the registration form. Then click on the Register button to submit. When showing this page, means the register form already submit. If you want to do mobile number or email binding, you need to configure email notification or SMS notification server. After configured the policy, you will need to enable redirect HTTPS request to Captive Portal if user is not authenticated. If you want to allow user to change their information, you will need to enable allow user to change user profile.